Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Good morning from Seoul, South Korea. Today we are going to head into the Korean War Memorial and Museum. It looks massive with indoor and outdoor areas. I'm excited we get to do this today. We ran out of time last weekend, didn't get a chance, but today we will. We have plenty of time, so we're going to see every nook and cranny that it has to offer. It looks like a pretty special place, and I can't wait to take you guys in and check it out. The Korean War was fought between 1950 and 1953, with the main belligerents being North and South Korea, but also South Korea being supported by the United Nations Command, primarily led by the United States, and North Korea being supported by the Soviet Union and China. Now, this is just 5 years after World War II, the greatest armed conflict human history has ever seen. So not only did it catch South Korea off guard, it also caught the rest of the world off guard when North Korea invaded South Korea over the 38th parallel. And as a result, that initial North Korean offensive pushed South Korean and Allied troops all the way back to the Pusan perimeter down in the south of the peninsula. Eventually, United Nations Command mustered up enough manpower and materiel to launch a counteroffensive, which was quite effective in pushing the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and all the way up to the Yalu River on the northern border with China. However, at that point, third-party intervention reached a new height, and the Chinese and Soviet Union were pouring more resources into the defense of North Korea, where the conflict reached kind of a grinding halt on both sides. The result was an armistice being signed in 1953, and as a result, still technically at war today. Now, this conflict is important because of the involvement not only of the United States but the rest of the United Nations Command, but given the current geopolitical state in the Asia region, this is still, an area of interest for peace and stability in the region. So, it still holds a lot of importance today. It wasn't just a long forgotten about war 70 years ago. Really looking forward to this. So here's some of the participants. Got Germany, Denmark, Sweden, I believe that's Ethiopia, Belgium, South Africa, Turkey, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, the United States. There's some other flags on the other side, so we'll go take a look at those. From afar, it looks like Italy, Norway, India, Colombia, Luxembourg, Greece, Thailand, Philippines, France, Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. So, not the entirety of the United Nations, obviously, but a lot of countries came to support. So, and even today, all these countries are contractually bound by the still existing United Nations Command. Like this command didn't dissipate after the armistice was signed in 1953. It still exists today, and all these countries still play a role in the defense of the South Korean peninsula if and when the time would ever be necessary again. So it's fascinating, and it's pretty amazing. Alright, we're inside now, so I'm going to try to find a map and figure out where we can go. It's quite dark, so I don't know if you can read it, but we're heading into the Memorial Hall now, and it says there are the true heroes of the Republic of Korea who gave their lives for the peace of the homeland. Over here it says the noble sacrifice of heroes became the eternal light that protects the Republic of Korea. This is the UN death registry roster, and it happens to be open to a random page, but these are KIAs from North Carolina. This portion of the museum looks at Korean military history dating back to early nation states, a couple thousand years ago. And the whole theme of this is they've had a long history of defending themselves, and that leads into, I guess, the overarching theme of the museum of defense of the fatherland, defense of their people and their way of life. So it's pretty cool how it's all tied in. Alright, now we're gonna head into the Korean War specific rooms. These the invasion tunnels. Something of interesting to note here. So July 14th, The Rock hands over operational command authority to the UN Forces Commander, which was at the time Douglas MacArthur in the United States, and that has not changed to this day. The United States still holds operational command authority over the UNC, which is pretty remarkable 70 years later. Kim Il-sung repeatedly requested permission to invade the South from both Mao Zedong in China and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Initially, it wasn't met with a whole lot of enthusiasm because particularly the Soviet Union really did not want to risk any deteriorated relations with the United States. However, neither side, meaning the Soviets and the Chinese, had an issue with the war, but really wanted North Korea to only fight if they were invaded by the South. However, eventually, both parties agreed to support the North Koreans in this endeavor. and thus Kim Il-sung sent his troops over the 38th. I guess I never realized how extremely unprepared the South Koreans were. I knew that it was a surprise, but they had 0 tanks, artillery pieces, and mortars. I mean, there was really no chance to slow this North Korean advance, pouring over the border with, at the time, state-of-the-art Russian T-34s. So the South Koreans stood no chance. So the North Koreans attacked all the way across the entirety of the 38th parallel, but their main goal, both militarily and politically, was Seoul. So a lot of their resources were, attacking all across the line at first, but eventually trying to pincer around and isolate the capital city. The South Koreans try to do their best to reinforce their forces on the front line from reserve units in the rear, but eventually Seoul was taken in just 3 days. Now, this might seem a little over-exaggerated, but it's not. At the start of the war, the South Korean Air Force only had about a dozen planes, and maybe close to a dozen, maybe a handful more pilots who could fly them. And they weren't combat planes; they were trainers like this. This goes to show how unprepared this ROK Air Force was at the early stages of the war, especially compared to modern air forces like the Soviets and the Chinese had at the time. So there's a painting that shows pretty much what this guy's doing, just dropping mortar shells out the side of a single-engine U.S. trainer plane. It's pretty remarkable that these are pieces of equipment that they had to fight an invading army with. Such the initial advances of the North Korean troops, the UN passed a security resolution that authorized UN troops to be deployed into combat operations in support of South Korea's defense. The U.S. Navy and, the U.S. Armed Forces, not just the Navy and Army, but Air Force, Navy, and Army were the first UN troops to be deployed to Korea, given its close proximity that they had troops stationed in Japan. Their main objective was to delay the North Korean advances so the South Korean army could be reorganized. They could set up an effective defensive perimeter. It didn't go too well at first, as the defensive line got pushed all the way back to the Pusan perimeter. You can see right here. Pusan perimeter was essentially the last defensive line that the UN forces established, and it was to keep this Busan port open. That was the lifeline for the entire Allied war effort. If they lose Busan, the war's over. That port delivered supplies, reinforcements, weapons, you name it. So that port had to stay open for the UN to continue fighting this war. By August 1950, the defensive lines along the Pusan perimeter were firmly in place here. And Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces, devised a plan, codenamed Operation Chromite, to take hundreds of naval vessels from Japan and Busan port and 70 to 75,000 troops and land them well behind enemy lines here at the port of Incheon, with the goal of recapturing Seoul and flipping the war on its head, turning the tide, and halting all the series of constant North Korean victories and advances. The plan was widely unpopular, especially with his Navy counterparts, because the port of Incheon is very narrow. It would be very difficult for a naval armada, let alone an invasion force, to navigate those waters. However, Douglas MacArthur said to proceed with the plan, and Operation Chromite was a huge success and did in fact change the tide of the war. A foothold was established at Incheon within 24 hours, and about a week later, UN and South Korean forces were able to recapture Seoul. And thus, all of the territory south of the 38th parallel just previously lost to the North Korean forces. It's a really cool painting. So in October of 1950, not even a month after the Incheon landings, troops from South Korea, the United States, British, Australia, and Turkey all took part in the Army's advance over the 38th parallel and into North Korea. The main reason for the advance of the 38th parallel is kind of twofold. One, the UN joined this conflict in order to defend South Korea and defeat the North Korean army. Two, once all the territory that was once lost south of the 38th parallel was recaptured by the South Korean and UN forces, Syngman Rhee, the president of the ROC, proposed a plan to march north, invade North Korea, and that is to abolish the 38th parallel border zone and reunify both North and South Korea. The Allied offensive north of the 38th parallel was initially very effective. Now, the Allied troops pushed North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River on the border of China. If you remember, months ago, as Kim Il-sung was preparing to invade the South, he lobbied with Mao Zedong of China to gain China's support of North Korea in the event the United States joins in support of South Korea. So, as the UN forces near the Chinese border, Mao Zedong and China get a little uneasy, so he authorized the deployment of 300,000 Chinese troops who crossed the Yalu River in support of the North Korean army. Now, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops involved, the once effective offensive north of the 38th parallel was stopped in its tracks. And now, with the help of the Chinese, North Korean forces have now pushed the Allied forces back off the Yalu River. And it's essentially the remainder of the war becomes a constant series of offensives and counteroffensives, and slowly the UN forces are pushed all the way back from the Yalu River in the north, down through North Korea, past Wonsan, past Pyongyang, and down back to the 38th parallel. After some brutal slogs through the stalemated battles, the UN forces and North Korean and Chinese forces finally signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. It's interesting to note that the South Korean government was left out of the armistice signing. It was signed between the Commander-in-Chief of Chinese forces, Kim Il-sung of North Korea, and General Clark, the current Commander-in-Chief of the the UN forces. Now, that's interesting to note because the war was waged initially through a UN resolution. So the UN forces are actually the combatants in this. And that plays an important role because of the armistice, what I was talking about earlier. It is still binding today. Hence why we still have a United Nations command in South Korea 70 plus years later. So part of the United Nations command, 22 countries sent troops, and I believe 42 sent war material and supplies. Over 1.7 million Americans participated and fought in the Korean War, with over 36,000 being killed in action and another 92,000 being wounded in action. In addition to the Americans, you had the Brits, Aussies, Canadians, and Kiwis from New Zealand. You have the Netherlands, France, and the Philippines, Turkey, Thailand, South Africa, and Greece, Belgium and Luxembourg, Ethiopia, and Colombia, Sweden, India, Denmark, Norway, Italy, Germany. These were the countries that sent medics and different combat medical teams to care for the wounded and sick. We've made our way to the heavy weapons room. So you got a lot of aircraft and tanks displayed. Got a F-86 up there. Korean MiG-15 up at the top. Shot plenty of those down. The ROK Air Force ended up using a lot of these U.S. fighters from World War II, like the P-51 here, because at the outbreak of the war, remember they were flying these tiny trainer and liaison aircraft that really didn't stand a chance against these MiGs. Here's the T-34, and North Korea poured over the border with hundreds of these things, and while South Korea had 0 tanks, so would have been pretty difficult to stop. Okay, we are headed to our last stop. It's the outdoor museum section. Looks like they got, man, I got a lot of stuff. Planes, vehicles, armor, missiles, artillery, even a boat. Revered F-4 Phantom. It's always a good sight, but not for this POS Chinese fighter. Shot a lot of those down too. And no aircraft display, at least a good one anyway, is complete without the good old B-52. Alright everyone, that concludes our visit here at the War Memorial of Korea. And let me tell you, this place is awesome. It really is awesome. They do it right. They have plenty of exhibits, displays, artifacts, and the wording is very informative for everyone. You know, if you don't have a whole lot of knowledge of the Korean War or Korean history in general, it gives you a good look into it without being overwhelming like some museums do. So I was really glad I spent close to 4 hours here. I could have spent way more, but if you're ever in Seoul, I highly recommend this museum, and it's a great place to take family. They have a children's museum and everything. So that concludes it here. We're gonna head to the subway station and figure out something else to do in Seoul. So thank you guys for watching. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until the next video, everyone have a great day. See ya.